is Natalya. I am a designer turned software engineer, and as exciting as that sounds, that really just means I get brought in to fix the CSS on a lot of projects. And, you know, if you want to put it more formally, it's like you get to bridge the gap between design and engineering, that famous gap that we always keep talking about. But I'm also an educator. And I'm actually a career switcher into tech, so if there are any career switchers here, I see you. That's hard. Yeah. And hopefully the perspective that I come to you today with is just another one. This is not one of those like, let's bridge the gap between design and development talks. This is a talk about people, and hopefully you all or somebody you know, and it'll be useful for you to become better coworkers or better people, or at least just have a fun story to tell someone. But I switched careers into tech from education, and that is the lens that I am going to try to take a look at this dynamic through. So like through the lens of an educator, when I hear the words like bridge the gap, what I really see is like, hey, there are two mental models here and they have to communicate. We need to build some tools right now to make sure that happens. And like, what do developers do really well is build tools for collaboration and communication. So let's do it. So yeah, I have to admit, like when I was like, I'm gonna do this talk, I just wanted to be like, we've got the declarative model that designers use. We've got the like imperative one that like programmers use, like whether it's like, you know, like we've got control flow or we've got designing things, and I was just like, this talk is done. This is gonna be great. But like with everything, things are actually a lot more complicated than the initial, like, here's a perfect dichotomy. Like there's two opposing sides, compare and contrast. Like that's just not how it is, and it's much more nuanced, more subtle, and more complicated. So let's talk about the larger pattern here. There is a larger pattern happening. It's about what happens at the intersections between mental models, and the thing is your entire career can be shaped by how you respond to what happens between mental models. And I hope I've got your attention. Like, this is research from education about like how people learn and what happens and how are we shaping our learning trajectories. And guess what? CSS is at an intersection of mental models, and that is probably why we hear such things like, is CSS programming, yes or no? Like, why is that debate still going on? If you Google it, like, you get millions of responses. Like, everybody's just like, yes, no. Here's my think piece on it on Medium, please read. We also hear, like, the never-ending, like, well, should designers or developers write CSS? Or who should own it? I mean, it's code, but it's there for making things pretty. And it's like, that's the wrong way to say it. And also, you know, then you get an argument going on. Again, there's a think piece on Medium about that, I'm sure. And then finally, like, the biggest giveaway that I always see is, like, is CSS broken? Or is it really, really intuitive? Like, is it counterintuitive or intuitive? Like, which one is it? Because I have seen people go full force saying one and the other and just arguing with each other. So, like, managing the complexity at the intersection of mental models is actually what makes CSS so incredibly powerful. Like, it's doing the thing between two different groups of people working under very different assumptions and different understanding of like how things should work, and you know they need to have different ideas. So then, like, why are we still arguing? Like, tweet it right now. It's solved. Like, it's an intersection. Like, why are we still arguing? Like, if it's broken and needs fixing, or if it works just fine. Like, what's going on here? And like, again, as an educator, this is textbook. This was in our textbook. Like, we learned about this, like, these arguments. These are incredibly predictable arguments. Like, these are, like, embarrassingly predictable arguments to anybody coming in from outside tech, with, like, any kind of educational background. So, like, it's not unique to tech. And like, I'm not making fun here. I love talking about like psychology, how people learn, how we acquire knowledge. Like that is literally what I did my graduate work in. It's not computer science, I'm sorry. And, you know, what I was doing was I was studying like, how does learning happen? How do we acquire knowledge? Like, what are the interventions when learning goes wrong? Like, how can we fix it? What are the different choices that we make? And how do those, like, how can we achieve above average learning? How do people fall in patterns of stagnation or below average learning? Like, all those things are real things you can study. And I did. So to understand why things get so heated around CSS, because like, face it, one of you, not one of you, like, you don't even have to raise your hand, but like if you've had to like defend CSS recently, I'm not gonna make your hand, raise your hand, but like if you've had to like have that like, please value me, please value what I do, like exasperated sigh, like that's what I'm really trying to like talk about here. It's the people and the work that we're doing, and like why are we still arguing about it? So we have to look at like, how do people learn? Like, why is CSS this thing where like perfectly capable people, programmers and designers and people writing it can arrive at such opposite conclusions about it? Like, what is that? And so think about it. Like, we are not a computer program. People learn differently. They don't just like read it line by line and like, ah, yes, more knowledge. More knowledge, more knowledge, more knowledge. Like, we create mental models and like these organized patterns of thoughts of like, this is how things work. And when we're faced with new information of some sort, we're like, I'm gonna either adapt my mental model or like assimilate this somehow and just keep building this robust mental model of how it works. And that means prior knowledge is key. Every new bit of information you take in has to interact with what you've already got in there. And so, like, it's really, really important what you learn first. So let's talk about someone who maybe, like, veer away from CSS for a minute. Anybody learn Haskell at any point? Can I see a hand? No. Oh, okay. Is that my husband? I can't. No, great. Oh, thank God. Okay, I was like, I saw an arm. I was like, my husband also likes Haskell. So, okay, if you learned Haskell, right, this like mathy, rigid, opinionated language, right, when you take up JavaScript, you might be like, well, this is chaos. It just lets you do whatever, anytime. This is dumb. It's broken. We should fix it. Whereas if like your first language is JavaScript, you're like, oh, this is the tool that allows me to figure out how to do things the way I want. It's so flexible. And Haskell is just this mean, opinionated, one way or the highway kind of thing. And then you can have that intersection where you can argue about it. It's another, mental models and like background knowledge and prior knowledge is exactly why a designer learning CSS might be like, oh, I just describe how things should look in a declarative way, like I declare some things and there it goes. They might think like, wow, thinking globally is awesome, the cascade is awesome, this maps nicely. Wow, thinking in layers, I already do that in Photoshop or Sketch or Figma, whatever. Whereas a programmer learning CSS might be like, cool, this looks like code. Why is everything global? Nothing is scoped. This is broken, I need to fix it right away. And so like, jokes aside, where you can be like, wow, look at the fun differences that make up a team, like how we all see things. Prior knowledge can also really interfere with how you acquire new information too. So I've actually taught people CSS Grid and found that people who were new to web development picked it up like that. They're like, oh, this is logical and makes total sense, got it. People who had to dump out float-based frameworks out of their heads first were scrambling. They're like, but I'm not thinking in columns anymore. I'm thinking in oh my God, and rows exist? Like, I just spent a whole lifetime like yelling at people, you static height or no multi-column, So like, it's amazing how a new beginner can pick something up when they're like, I don't really have a mental model for how it works. I have to like acquire it from scratch. And you know that feeling when you start from scratch and you finally get it working and you feel your first confidence, right? That feeling is good, and that's the good part of this slide. That first feeling of when you like make your first patterned like organized thought of like, this is how it works. Your first JavaScript hello world, or your first background color red, whatever it is you start with, that feels really, really, really good. Being good at stuff feels good, like not a new concept. And then you're like, all right, I'm on a roll. I'm gonna try something new. I am like good at stuff. I'm getting things working. I'm feeling confident. And you try something different and you step outside of your comfort zone, and all of a sudden you're met with a different way of things working. It doesn't feel good. It feels very bad when you're like, why would someone make something so frustrating? Why would someone do it this way? It's clearly broken. It's not how it's supposed to work. That's just new information butting up against your model of how things should work, and you're not quite sure where to put it, what to do with it. That's called cognitive dissonance. And like, that's all your teachers are ever trying to make you feel, is to make you feel bad. Like, right? Like, that's why we're like, teachers, we don't like those. Like, the bad feeling of cognitive dissonance and being confronted with a different way of thinking is actually like really critical to learning. If you never feel this, like, you're not gonna be learning. You're just gonna keep doing the exact same thing. And like, a lot of people are predictably quite content learning one thing once and then just cruising in on that as long as they possibly can. I'm also not judging them. Like, we need people to do that also. But if you are really thinking about like your career trajectory, cognitive dissonance is like, you should be hungry for that. But there are larger like community-wide implications. Just like, I mean, this is also not really new information. Like, learning stuff should be hard. You should feel challenged. Like, that's not new. But what's kind of looking through the lens of an educator, looking at the community at large and what's happening between different communities, like people who work with CSS and are really involved with CSS, people who are like in the JavaScript community. Then you also have the communities popping up with like, you've got React and Vue, and you've got the Angular crowd. Like, it's a pretty big world out there. And all of a sudden, these reactions have pretty serious consequences. So when a beginner learner is confronted with something new, they will most likely have that reaction of like, this is horrible, I don't want to do this. And they have the platform of the internet to go out and loudly proclaim that opinion, whether it be on Twitter or, again, a Medium think piece. Those are really, like, you should have a blog. That's the advice everybody gets nowadays. You're able to take these private frustrations that should be just like, this is just what happens when you learn in private in a classroom, and then like a nice teacher tells you like, don't worry, like, keep on. And instead you reject it, and you go online, you say, this is broken, this is terrible, and somebody reinforces that and says, hits that like button or responds with like, yeah, it is broken, and you are right to feel this way. You will probably find yourself kind of backing away from that cognitive dissonance and kind of further insulating yourself in your comfort zone. And that's got really, really serious career implications beyond just like what framework you're going to be stuck using. You're going to be someone who is not only shutting down your own ability to switch between different mental models and learn different ways of thinking, you're also going to be a voice in the community that shuts down the next beginner who shows up, has no idea what's going on, but all of a sudden realizes, this person I like says CSS is broken. Or this person says JavaScript is chaos. Or this person says designers shouldn't code, coders shouldn't design, or this or that. Really strongly held opinions. And that can really limit people and create a lot of arbitrary barriers that we can then spend almost a lifetime deconstructing, both internalized and in our communities. And that's really grim, and it's probably why I get to go in and say like, okay, we've got this gap between design and development. Who's been yelling that designers shouldn't touch code? Who's been saying, developers aren't creative, please stay out of my sketch files, and like creating these barriers? And those like reactions being amplified and validated is also why we keep having the same debate. Is CSS broken or is it awesome? It's because instead of actually having the more nuanced conversations, we're just building up those barriers. And it's got really serious consequences. You see people siloed in jobs, in roles, unable to collaborate even with the person sitting next to them, because it just no longer feels possible, like, that we're even allowed to have these conversations or be multidisciplinary. Like, I would really love to talk to you after this meetup. Like, are you allowed to be multidisciplinary at your job? Like, where is that magical place where you're not the exception, where you don't have to, like, be siloed into these tiny little corners, and where you realize that you have to be incredibly proactive to actually be able to move forward in your career, to be able to keep up with the new trends and new changes, because you are stuck and you're not able to learn. So now that I've completely bummed you out, if anybody needs to, like, all right, I'm gonna go get a beer or something, I'm actually gonna give you the actionable things to move forward and unblock yourself, maybe your team, or, just be that person who's like, there's, a way out of this kind of terrible, grim, sad place where we're all just like one-dimensional people who can't collaborate and feel good about ourselves. Because these barriers that that seem so real and so, like, hardened, like, this is just the way things are, the way things work. They're also our mental model of how things work, and it's incredibly arbitrary. And so hopefully this is something you can assimilate into your mental model of how, this is very meta, I'm sorry. And it'll give you some tools for actually, like, going back to your workplace and being like, we should do this. So I want to start with, like, kind of zoom in back to an anecdote. And so I have some former students in this room. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about it. But I want to share, like, the anecdote for one of the assignments you may actually remember from our class, where, one of the first things I do is, like, I ask, like, who are you? What's your background? What are your skills? And then I also make sure to ask, like, what do you want to work on? Where are you trying to, grow with it? And the course it's called Modular Design Patterns with React, which is essentially, in a nutshell, UI engineering using React, the awesome, if nobody's heard of React, I'm just a big advocate for it. I really like it. It's fun. Come talk to me afterwards. But it's essentially, it's focused on that gap between design and engineering, and the intersection between the two. So we have, like, graphic designers in the class, and, like, seasoned backend developers who are like, I only write Java at work. I'm really curious about CSS. And it creates this, like, awesome opportunity for people to step out of those silos that they've been forced to in their workplaces, without the, like, hey, if you mess up, I'm going to take your paycheck, risk. And so, like I said, I get to know these students and assess their skill sets at the beginning. And then, at one point, I lull them into safety and I assign this project that's like, you have to do this little, project just like on any tech team. Like, you've got a designer, you've got a front-end engineer, you've got all this stuff. But you have to pick the one you're worst at. Like, once you've given away your cards, you have to switch around and just be like, the programmer with that 15 years of Java experience, like, you're responsible for the designs and making sure everything is, like, really pleasant to use. If you're an SEO expert, you get to be the Git expert for our team. And if you're a graphic designer, you are now writing our JavaScript. Like, you're responsible for this. And of course, like, I try to hide my smile when I see, like, the panic, but it's like I create that cognitive dissonance situation where you're like, oh my God, this feels bad. I don't want to do it. This is all wrong. I want to go into my comfort zone, but I have to do something else. And the results were great. Like, at the end of the course, like, people were like, wow, I'm really glad I had the opportunity to step outside of it. I know how to be a better collaborator with the people who do this job every day, because now I understand both the kind of breadth of their work and what I'm supposed to do there. It's like, you get better at your own job by doing something else, but I don't really have to make the case for, like, please do breadth, it's good for you. But the idea here is like, if you are working on a team and you don't know who your coworkers are, what their backgrounds are, and what they want to work on, ask them. Step one, ask them. And then create opportunities to where they can feel safe experimenting with a different skill set. That's just like one of the simplest little things you can do. But of course, this is what I'm really talking about, is the ability to practice flexibility. Just as being able to like say, okay, yeah, I'm going to be the designer, even though I literally don't understand like what designers do at work. I just kind of tell them, give me those files or whatever. I'm just being so harsh today. I'm sorry. But like, you know, the reason I'm so passionate about this is because it's true. Like those who practice flexibility, which is like a skill you can lose. You can stop being flexible. Everybody knows somebody who you're like, oh man, I'm not going to tell them about this new thing, or like, it's just going to be such a miserable experience. But those who are able to practice flexibility tend to surpass those who repeatedly reject the challenges of other ways of thinking. And above average learning takes deliberate effort and not just hours spent. And so you see my unicorn emoji here. I'm really like one of those people like, stop calling people mythical creatures when they can do two things. Like, like, you know, it's just like, I don't remember who said it at work, but it was just like, can't we just like settle for a good horse? Like, it's okay. Like, we don't have to just be unicorns, but like, they're not mythical creatures. Multidisciplinary people like exist everywhere. It's so weird to step into tech and just see people be oh yeah, people are one-dimensional. You're good at one thing. You're either logical or creative. It's like, you really like your Booleans over here. It's cool. Like, anyone can be a unicorn if they challenge themselves and practice that flexibility. And it's like, you don't have to be, but you can. It's just deliberate effort and practice in a specific way, not just hours spent, will get you there. Like, that's just, you can learn anything. There's no like, sorry, I put too many points in the logic category, so actually creativity is now inaccessible to me. It's like all the research in education is like people who tend to be really creative also tend to be pretty good at other stuff. So it's like, if you're very creative, you're gonna be able to grasp engineering, and if you're very good at engineering, you're gonna be able to just fine with design and just learn those patterns. It's like, you're not gonna need to be a literal mythical creature. But yet, like, that's what just we keep doing that. Like, it's arbitrary, and you know, and instead we just kind of have these weird moments where we're like, your way's dumb, let's not do that. End of conversation. The end. Again, back to being bummed out, very grim. So let's talk about, again, I promised proactive tools, so we're getting to them. Proactive tools, other than just accepting that you can be a multidisciplinary person, is you create tools for collaboration. And so when I say that, like, if this is where you kind of live in your workflows at work, where it's like, you know, you've got like, we've got some design assets and some like wild guesses happen, and then you've got some sort of application code, you know, you need a design system. And a design system, essentially, it's not just like the style guide or like there are so many parts of it. When I say design system, I mean like, I literally mean like a whole system. And what I really want to focus in on is something that I like to set up to get people to do their best work on a team. So like, there's a whole lot of stuff that we can talk about style guides. This is not where I'm focusing, like the documentation of all your buttons and things. This is more about like what happens in between instead of a bunch of wild guesses. Like, it's part of your process. It's part of what you're doing to make sure that the ideas and the mental models of how things should work from your designers aren't lost, and they're transferred through an interface. Programmers build interfaces between things all the time. An interface of some sort, a tool that you build that is custom to your team, so that when you get your application code, all of those ideas are intact. Your buttons don't turn to divs. Your, you know, like components are broken out in the correct way that you anticipate them being broken out. And so you see those lines actually go backwards and forwards, so that then again too, if you've got like, if you are building things with React, you don't get a bunch of PDFs designed, so that your designers are also like, what are our constraints? What's our system? What are we working with? Like, what's in the code? What's the transparency into that? So ultimately, you want to respond to the needs you have, and it goes back to like, who's on your team? Ask them what they know, and then figure out a system for that. This is not a one-size-fits-all by any means, and in fact, it's actually an anti-one-size-fits-all. So like, to give you an example, like, what is this random box of mystery of like, and then things magically work. I helped out on a project where we had a designer who was really amazing at design, just like really great at design, some HTML and CSS skills, but not so great on the JavaScript. And then we had our front end, kind of back end, full stack developer who like could build just about anything, could hack some CSS if they had to, really was like pretty mild at HTML to say the least, and who also was like, I just don't want to be writing the CSS. Like, that was not what they wanted to be doing. But unfortunately, the project that they were working on was a React project where it's like, you needed to know JavaScript to enter. You needed to know all these layers of abstractions on top of stuff, and you couldn't just write CSS. You couldn't just write, like, there was a whole bunch of stuff that essentially put it out of the reach of the designer. And instead of going to a system where like, okay, well, you don't know how our code works, stick to just giving us some asset files, and then, going back to this, like, I'm sorry, I can't contribute code to your really cool, amazing, abstracted application. And having the developer be, the full stack person, be responsible for absolutely everything. What we did was we set up an interface that allowed the designer to write HTML and CSS. So like, yeah, we documented stuff like, we got all these things here. I'm not saying they got to say like use button primary or use whatever. It wasn't just like them using the library that was already built, but it was actually being able to contribute code at their level, which I will zoom in on this probably. That doesn't work. I'll have this online, which like write it twice and then stop having the conversation about like, who messed up here, who messed up there. This is essentially what we set up, is like a little prototyping area inside the application where the designer could go into one HTML file and one CSS file and write just vanilla as vanilla as they needed to, where it was like, every list item is listed out with some kind of like just static data that didn't come from anywhere. It wasn't connected to anything. It was just like lorem ipsum everywhere. Just get it into the browser as soon as humanly possible. Let's resize it. Let's not have a million like asset files with all the different breakpoints. Like, let's just see how it works. You've got your semantic HTML all of a sudden. You've got your sections, your mains, your asides. It's like the nice dream that you want to have. And then once that's done, the developer, who is the master of their domain, of just like, okay, well, we're going to abstract this out into this specific library that we're using this specific way, that you need this much expertise in writing, and they could just take it from one simple HTML and CSS file and like put it into the components, put it into CSS and JS, put it into the modules, whatever they wanted to put it into that would work for them. Map over the data, connect it to Redux, whatever they needed to make so that it would be code that would be ready to ship. And the response to this was pretty great. It unblocked the asset to code pipeline, because this was the conversation, this was the interface, this is the, you could suddenly have the designer and the developer talking very clearly, like, here it is in the browser, it's doing the thing, and here's the code that kind of was where we need to get it. And they could kind of have that extra step between when it would just be a mock-up or a wireframe and when it would make it into its application. And this ended up being really powerful because you've got all of the mental model of what the designer was working on be able to go through and make it into the application. And as they're working together, the designer was able to pick up more JavaScript and more patterns that like they were seeing repeating. They could see like, oh, well, here's how the shape of the data is going to come in. So this is how I could start thinking about designing my components. I see how you're, where you're taking it. And the developer was able to like learn like, oh, what are all these extra element tags I should learn about? Like, I should Google these. And so the designer and the developer ended up actually bringing both of each other up with this. And it's like, felt really good. Like, it was a really nice time, and it made a really positive work environment. And it's just a simple matter of making sure that inside of your application you have a place for people, just kind of like a scratch pad, somewhere where they can put code that exists. You can use all the variables, all the mix-ins, all the abstractions that you already have in your code, And someone who maybe isn't very strong with coding is able to have both transparency into the code and a meaningful way to contribute at the level where they are. Because let's be honest, like, it's getting much more complicated in front end, and it feels like the bar just keeps going higher and higher and higher where your first contribution can be, and that's contributing to the siloing. I feel like every year we're having to keep bridging more of a gap and like keep coming up with new names, front-end designer, and it's it really is just, again, about people and your team, and just asking, like, how can I make it simpler for someone to make a meaningful contribution? And so, like, there are so many different options for how to implement this. Like, who's interested in doing what? It's very, I don't want to say the word simple to set this up, but it just takes a little bit of time for someone on your team to set a little place like this up, where maybe it's just flagged on dev or staging somewhere you can't even see it publicly, just a preview where something that you're designing can live in the browser and get that bit closer to what you're actually trying to ship. And I like to say it's like it leaves no gap to bridge. Like, it makes it a lot nicer so that you don't then have to like bring someone in to like, we have to fix this. This is super broken. And so, like, you get to join the others doing the work to enable people. Like, all of a sudden, instead of being like the grumpy person who's like, I'm stuck writing code and I can't design, or like, I'm a designer who now, like, I know good HTML and CSS, but like, whatever's going on with JavaScript, like, I don't have the time to be an expert in all of it. Like, I'm focused on the user, not on, learning whatever framework we're using, or like, oh, great, we just switched to another one. Like, you can just feel kind of excited about being proactive about managing both your career and being able to create opportunities for either yourself or for your team to start kind of building that cognitive dissonance and stretching their skills. And so, like, it's really hard to not get riled up by all of the people just like arguing about CSS, arguing about JavaScript, arguing about everything. But when you actually really listen and tune into everything, it's actually really nice how collaborative people really are, and like how warm the people in these communities can be. And so if you just take a look at it, like, tools for collaboration are being built all around you. And, like, if you look on the SketchUp website, they have a code export tool, right? Like, it's there so that if you are, okay, I'm just a designer working in a graphic program, and I need the words to explain to the person taking my designs and putting them into code, you can see a code export where you can get the conversation started. You're like, oh, this is a background image, or like, this is, border radius or something. Like, you can start kind of being able to build that vocabulary, a shared vocabulary. React could have just been like, this is how we write all our HTML now. Const element is H1, and they could have just gone that way and left a whole lot of people out. But instead of saying like H1 with class name greeting hello world, they got it pretty close. Somebody who knows how to write HTML can be like, why are we camel casing this? You know what? I'm up to date now. I'm writing HTML inside of JavaScript. It's JSX, but suddenly you're able to meaningfully contribute in somebody's React application. They famously say, like, we don't separate technologies, but we still very much separate concerns. And so if you know HTML, you're able to, like, this would probably trip you up. You're like, what's going on? But you can contribute, and that's really powerful. And then none of the emojis work when you present. CSS modules, and this is from Glenn Mattern's site. It basically says, like, hey, we made these, like, we like CSS, and we wanted to build upon the work by the Styles and JS community. And, like, thanks, friends, for pushing the boundary. Like, this isn't mean or arguing. Like, they're working together to find different ways of doing something for different mental models. And I like the positivity of it. And then there's also tools like the Firefox Grid Inspector tool, which Jen Simmons is also a really cool website that she collaborated with browser designers on. And it was like, how do we show people like what your mental model of what CSS grid is, how do we get people working with it, and get it from looking just like code to something that someone more visually like oriented can go, well, like they created this tool, which they called this like the waffle icon. I don't know what it's actually called, but after I heard that, I can't unlearn it. Where you click this and you can see the grid, you can, there's a whole layout panel in Firefox now to where you can visually see like, what are my grid lines? What are the rows? Like, what have I set up? And that's an incredible tool that's available in Firefox right now. So that like, you can, if you're still using float-based layout, this one really helps to stop thinking in columns and start thinking in grid lines, because it is different. So those are the takeaways, really. It's just, this is a bit of a meandering kind of both a call to action to embrace cognitive dissonance, which I imagine is hard to do after a long workday where you're like, also, if I embrace it too much, then I get fired, and like, it's hard. It's not a safe place to do this at work, and so I appreciate you all being out here in the evening and like, but embrace the cognitive dissonance, because that whole like 10,000 hours to achieve mastery. It's like asterisks. It's a deliberate practice that's actually going to get you there. 10,000 hours of the same exact thing with no cognitive dissonance isn't going to do a thing. It's just going to be like, wow, you spent a lot of time doing that. But the other thing I really love that I learned is it only takes 50 hours to not completely suck at something. So where like you stop making those beginner mistakes where then you find like it's like around that time somebody says like, wow, you're pretty good at this, and you're like, yeah. All right. So it doesn't even take a 10,000 hour kind of immersion into things. It could be as little as like 50 hours over time where you just like embrace being like, this is going to feel bad, and I'm going to feel bad about it, and I'm not going to be good at it, and it's going to feel backwards. And that means you're learning, and that's a good thing. Instead of going on Twitter and saying how bad something is, just kind of wait a bit, learn it, and then be like, that's right, now I can help others learn this too. And then I can build tools for collaboration. So like, build a little sandbox in your application, or get someone to build it with you so that you're able to be like, are you tired of looking at my sketch files for hours at a time? Like, we can solve that. Or, hey, would you like to know what's actually going on in the code, and like how many gray variables we still have in there? Like, which ones what if we just put them all out there and just see which ones we should keep? And ultimately what that does is that it's just like such a small shift to make, but it makes you make a much more positive impact when you've got so many beginners going into this, and it's a very important thing to be a positive voice in the community, someone who isn't making like angry statements about framework A or framework B, because those get a lot of clicks, those get a lot of attention, and those get validated really, really, really hard. But ultimately, if you ask any educator how far that gets people, not very far. And it can really derail an entire career. And being able to be someone who both embraces flexibility, it makes you an above average learner. It makes you someone who builds community, builds tools, and make a positive impact. That's going to make all the difference. So that's it for me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to talk. So do we have time for Q&A, or how do we?
Yeah.
Great. Yes.
I have a question. So your leave no gap behind, it's like visual person. Thank you. So
Yes.
leave no gap to bridge comparison here. I work on a design system, so and it's React components. And there's always this debate about
And if you can't see, like,
every
come up here.
element
It's
should be
very
wrapped
small.
as a React component. Like so here you have like section, article, which is set for you, as a person who loves semantic HTML. It's like, I'm like, why not use just a section? There's this big debate internally of like, hey, if a developer wants to add, a horizontal rule in that JSX, it's like, we should wrap that in components. Like, why can't you just throw in, a horizontal rule that looks like, HTML, it's really JSX? Like, what's your theory on, or thoughts on, I mean, I love this whole like code sandbox thing. I'm just wondering, would this translate to an actual design system component? Like you make a section component, you make a list component, and for things that are just semantic HTML, which is a horizontal rule, which all it is you're heading a class. Like, where do you draw the line where you make everything a component, or are there any exceptions?
First,
if you want to take this?
I love your pun about where do you draw the line, and you were talking about a horizontal rule.
But awesome.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think ultimately the hardest part about this is that whoever sets up the system gets to decide how it goes, and the CSS developer is never the one who sets up the system unless they're, they're the unicorn that was hired to do both. I think it really is like, I prefer to have like a component for like, we have the list component, or we have, like if it's a pattern, let's make a component. But if it's just like a one-off, like I just prefer not to optimize things until it's time.
Right.
But people love writing components. So like you can take that away from them if you can. I just have yet to.
True, but if you're also doing both the CSS and the component writing, put your foot down and say, it's overkill to do like a horizontal rule.
And once again, that's a people problem when they're like, I'm really comfortable writing components. Are we sure we want to go with this semantic HTML, which I am just not 100% about? Like, but I can write a component. I don't know. It seems like a people question.
Like copying that into the component. It's more education of knowing semantic HTML.
It's also like whoever touches it last a lot of times gets to decide too, which is just like, do you want to volunteer for that? It's like, that can be you. So a lot of collaboration and a lot of compromise, I think.
Cool.
But yeah, I feel like if there are a lot of people optimizing way like they're like, we can make this thing and it can be flexible and whatever. It's like we need it once and never again. So yeah, I don't know. Everybody's like, oh yeah, I know that. Yeah, hopefully that answered it kind of.
It does.
Yes.
Hey, you said mental model a bunch of times. I was just wondering what your definition of
An organized pattern of thought of how things work. So no, there are many definitions, but the one that I specifically kind of try to reference here is this really fun educator back in the day called Piaget, who pioneered a lot of this. If you want to Google him, he is awesome. But essentially, it's just like, when people were doing a lot of psychological research, like how do people learn? Like, a lot of times people thought students are just dumb. You should just yell things at them until they understand it. Like, that's where they lecture. Sorry, I'm literally lecturing you about how terrible it is. Like, I believe project-based learning is better, but, sometimes there's a podium and I just, but essentially it's like, look up Piaget, and actually it's a really fun thing. Like, if you want to go down a rabbit hole of like Wikipedia stuff, like look up learning theories, project-based learning, and like creativity killers. All these things have been researched, and like what makes people be afraid of taking chances. It's like there's literally a bullet point list. Just avoid those things at work the best you can, and you'll suddenly find people taking more chances. The same thing for like mental models. Like, how do people learn? It's like, well, they get like, there's so many theories on it, but the one about mental models specifically is like, it's just Piaget, which he talked about these, he called them schemes, which in a room full of developers, I don't want to talk about schemas or schemes, or like, we don't want to syntax, like, we don't want to mess this up, but essentially it's just like the first time you feel a competency, you get that like click of like, this is how it works, and your brain is just trying to organize things into patterns as fast as humanly possible. And that's why like you kind of get this idea of what this is, and every new piece of information comes in and like butts up against your prior knowledge. And so that's why, there's this term of scaffolding. It's like, actually Vygotsky is another educator you should check out, Vygotsk. He talks about like, it's called the zone of proximal development, which is essentially, there's this like wiggle room between what you can do on your own, what you can do with some mentorship and assistance, or like scaffolding, like, hey, maybe someone architects your system for you and you're able to contribute at a higher level than if you were trying to do it on your own. And then there's like that panic section after that, where like it's outside of that zone, where like no matter what, you can't contribute yet because it's outside of what you're able to kind of leap to next. So it's also just understanding like, where's someone's knowledge, where can they contribute now? Where can they contribute with just a few hints, or maybe like work in this file? Maybe take a look at it this way, think about it this way at a high level. And then also like where you're just going to plunge them off a cliff into sheer panic. Like that's also really irresponsible if you're managing people or if you're working on a team. Just be like, here, it's simple, just do it. That's why, when you see articles who are like, you simply do, those don't work very well. They just help the panic. There's a way longer answer than you needed, but essentially look up Piaget and like his learned mental model idea stuff. It's pretty old, but it holds up pretty nicely. Yes.
So I feel like a lot of what you talked about was like talking about thought pieces on Medium, saying like CSS is the worst, CSS is the best. But what I was thinking is that's a lot of the people who get to the cognitive dissonance phase and kind of back off and say I feel this way.
Mm-hmm.
But what about a case where someone pushes through that, feels like they really grasp things, but still says it's broken? Like, do you think there's a place for thought pieces that can maybe come off as overly negative or positive, but come from a place of like deeply knowing something, like thinking you need to know something?
I come off as overly positive in my Medium think pieces. Please follow me on Medium. But I mean, like, I feel like if you, I'm not really saying like, oh, only nuanced reactions are the correct ones. I just think that it's the lightning fast one where once you hit that cognitive dissonance, you just lash out at it really quickly, like tweet it. We make it really easy with the technology available and the platforms that we are able to amplify people into. Like, there are a lot of people, a lot of followers who can say one thing and then that's what people believe and it's almost a fact. Whereas it could have just been like, they tried and they didn't like it and whatever. So I think like if somebody says, actually, I think there's a better way, I think that's a lot of how things move forward, It's absolutely like, if there was thought behind it and it's not just like the snap decision, yes, like more think pieces. As much as I make fun of them, like I have those. Oh, and also final plug, I am teaching my class again. So Modular Design Patterns with React at the Harvard Extension School. I'm probably breaking a rule by saying this, but no, seriously, if you want to see more things where like we do UI kind of around React and how do we structure things, that's basically the class with lots of projects and a lot less talking from me. This is a lot more talking that I like to. Just kidding. I love doing talking. I'll be honest here, but so I guess like we should break it out into like more kind of mingly stuff, because I would also love for all of you all to meet each other. But I'll just be around answering questions. Also, we have a young little attendee here. That's my daughter back there. She's 1, and she listened to the whole thing, and I am very impressed by that. So, and that's my husband Tim too. Yeah. So yeah, come say hello afterwards, but otherwise please mingle with each other, and thank you for coming out.
Thank you.